Sit down, Commander. Your flying museum has no place here. The war room roared with laughter as a single keystroke erased her plan. Abort all bomber missions. Aria Kessler stood silent, jaw locked, her idea for the B-52 dismissed as Relic fantasy. Minutes later, F-35 seconds and drones burned across the horizon, shredded by enemy fire, while the generals sank into panic. Then the forgotten giant roared to life, dust raining from steel beams, its shadows swallowing the runway. Guided by Aria's hand, the Stratofortress dove low over the sea, skimming waves, outsmarting radar, defying firestorms. Seconds later, the coastline erupted in flame, enemy batteries obliterated under her rain of steel, and in the command center, the same generals who mocked her froze in disbelief. This is Veteranbiker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. Sit down, Commander. Your flying museum has no place here. The insult cracked like a rifle shot across the operations center. Dozens of officers in pressed uniforms shifted in their chairs, some smirking, others outright laughing. The statement came from General Rourke Medan, his voice sharp with disdain, his finger stabbing at the holographic map that glowed red with enemy emplacements. Aria Kessler didn't answer. She stood behind the table, shoulders squared, her posture rigid as steel. Her suggestion to deploy the old B-52 Stratofortress had been mocked, dismissed, and finally struck down with a single order typed into the command system: abort all bomber missions. The words pulsed on the screen in brutal clarity, a digital stamp of humiliation. The air in the command chamber felt thick, heavy with condescension. Younger officers exchanged grins, some whispering Relic under their breath. Others avoided eye contact, unwilling to be caught siding with the lone commander who dared to propose something outside the modern playbook. Aria's jaw tightened, but she refused to flinch. General Medan leaned forward, his decorated chest gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights.
This isn't the Cold War, Kessler.
We have F-35 seconds, drones, precision strike capabilities. You want to roll a dinosaur into battle and pray it doesn't fall apart on takeoff? Ridiculous. His words set off another ripple of laughter. On the far side of the room, one colonel covered his mouth to hide a grin, while another let out a low whistle as if mocking her boldness. Still, she held her ground. "Sir," she said evenly, her voice calm but edged with determination. "The Stratofortress is built for endurance. It carries payloads nothing else in our fleet can match. Against that concentration of enemy artillery on the Solara Gulf, precision fighters will be torn apart. We need saturation firepower." Madden cut her off with a hand, dismissing her words before she finished. "I've heard enough." "You're clinging to ghosts, Commander. We fight wars with technology, not antiques." His hand hovered over the console, and with a deliberate press of a key, the command display updated. Mission plan denied. The screen's glow reflected in Aria's eyes, but she didn't look away. Silence stretched for a heartbeat too long before the murmurs began again. Muttered jokes about rusted engines, about scrapyard bombers, about a commander out of her depth. She turned, stepping back from the table. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, though her pulse hammered like a drum. She knew the stakes. She knew what was coming outside these walls. And she also knew that in this room, surrounded by polished brass and smug faces, her voice carried no weight. Then came the alarm. The operations center fell into an uneasy quiet as the siren wailed, low and urgent. Screens flared with incoming reports, enemy missile batteries powering up, radar arrays tracking airborne signatures, launchers swiveling toward the sea. The attack on the Solara Gulf perimeter had begun. General Madden barked for F-35 squadrons to be launched immediately. Drone operators scrambled, their fingers flying across consoles as unmanned craft streaked toward the red zone on the display. For a brief moment, the room's mood shifted, mockery giving way to grim focus. Aria watched, silent, as the operation unfolded. Fighter icons moved into formation. Drones cut across the digital horizon. The generals leaned forward, eyes locked on screens, muttering confidence to themselves. This will work. This must work. But it didn't. The first wave hit the kill zone, and within seconds, red arcs rose from the enemy's defenses. Surface-to-air missiles streaked skyward, each one finding a target. The display lit with violent flashes as fighters winked out of existence, their signals vanishing in bursts of static. "Eagle 2 is gone!" someone shouted from the comms desk. "We've lost Phantom Flight!" another cried. Drone operators cursed under their breath as their feeds dissolved into static snow. The war room erupted into chaos. Generals shouted conflicting orders, staff tried to reroute surviving aircraft, but the screen filled with falling icons. F-35 after F-35 vanished. Drone wings collapsed under the sheer density of anti-aircraft fire. The Solara Gulf lit up like a storm front, and the cutting-edge arsenal Madan had placed his faith in was shredded in minutes. Around the table, the officers who had laughed at Aria now sat stiff, eyes wide, lips pressed into thin lines. The smirks were gone. The room reeked of fear, of disbelief. And still, Aria said nothing. She stood with her arms crossed, gaze steady on the chaos unfolding. Inside, fury burned, not the kind that lashed out, but the kind that calcified resolve. General Madden slammed a fist against the table. "Send reinforcements!" he barked, but the response came back immediately. "Sir, reinforcements can't break through the defenses. We're feeding pilots into a slaughter." The realization was written on every face. Their superior firepower had failed. Their doctrine had failed. And they had no alternative. Madan's voice faltered. We'll find another way. There has to be." His words trailed into silence as he stared at the map, the gulf awash with red markers and extinguished blue. Aria finally spoke, her tone level but unyielding. "I warned you. Saturation firepower is the only way to breach that line. Precision isn't enough." Her words hung in the air like a blade. No one laughed this time, no one even breathed, but Madden shook his head, clinging to authority. "Even if I wanted to, the bombers are grounded. You don't have clearance, and you never will." The tension in the room snapped taut. Aria's eyes narrowed, but she gave no reply. Instead, she stepped back once more. Her face unreadable, her mind already racing far ahead of the conversation, because she knew what had to be done. She left the command center without asking permission. No one stopped her. Most were too absorbed in the crumbling battle on the screens, but a few pairs of eyes followed her as she passed through the doorway. And in those glances lay something new, not mockery, not laughter, but the beginning of doubt. Out on the tarmac, the sun beat down, the heat shimmering above the concrete. In the distance, past rows of modern fighters and humming drones, a shadowed hangar loomed. Inside, forgotten under dust and silence, waited the beast she had defended in vain. The Stratofortress. Aria's boots struck the pavement with steady rhythm as she walked toward it. Each step carried the weight of defiance, of resolve. Behind her, the alarms still wailed, carrying news of disaster. Ahead, in the darkness of the hangar, the old bomber waited, scarred, neglected, but unbroken. And Aria Kessler, silenced in the war room, was already planning how to give the relic a voice no one could ignore. The hangar doors groaned as they slid apart, a shaft of sunlight piercing the gloom inside. Dust swirled in the beam, catching on the outlines of the massive shape waiting within. The Stratofortress stood there, wings stretching wide in silence, its skin dulled and pocked from years of neglect. To most, it looked like a relic. To Aria Kessler, it was the last card worth playing. She stepped inside, the echo of her boots hollow against the concrete floor. Her fingers brushed the cool metal of the fuselage, tracing lines faded by time. For a brief second, she remembered the first time she had climbed into one, her heartbeat racing. With the thrill of flying, something built not just for precision but for sheer dominance. That memory hardened her now. A cough echoed from the shadows. "I figured I'd find you here." Captain Elias Rawdon stepped out from behind a support beam, oil stains on his sleeves, a smirk tugging the corner of his mouth. His hair had gone silver at the temples, but his eyes carried the sharpness of a man who had logged thousands of hours in the air. "You think this old beast will even start?" he asked, gesturing at the bomber with a half-laugh. Aria met his gaze. "It will. And we're going to fly it." He raised a brow but didn't argue. Instead, he glanced back into the hangar, whistling low. From the far end, figures began to emerge, men and women she had flown with years before, veterans who had been quietly sidelined in favor of modern platforms. Sergeant Lila Corrin, tall and lean, carrying a toolbox under one arm. Chief Engineer Dawson Miles, broad-shouldered and heavy-set, wiping grease from his palms. A handful of others, each carrying the same expression, half disbelief, half anticipation. No one had been summoned. They had come because they knew. Word had traveled fast that the new toys had failed and the command center was unraveling. They hadn't needed Aria's voice. The situation itself had called them. "This is madness," Dawson said, running a hand across the bomber's flank. "Half her systems haven't been powered in years." Aria's answer was steady. "Then we'll make them work, or we won't come back." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with something close to reverence. Then Lila set down her toolbox with a clang. "Where do we start?" Within minutes, the hangar came alive. Tools clattered, panels hissed open, hydraulic lines were checked, fuel pumps tested. The Stratofortress groaned as systems that had been dormant sparked reluctantly awake. Lights flickered across the console as auxiliary power hummed. Dust shook loose from vents, curling upward in pale spirals. Aria moved among them, her presence quiet but commanding. She didn't need to bark orders. Each member knew their role, and each trusted her enough to push forward. The energy in the air was tense, a balance between desperation and faith. Elias climbed the ladder to the cockpit and slid into the pilot's chair, hands roaming over the controls with familiarity. "Feels like coming home," he muttered, flicking a switch. The dashboard lit unevenly, but it lit. Down below, Dawson shouted, "Fuel lines are holding steady. We've got flow." "Hydraulics are responsive," Lila added, wiping sweat from her brow. One by one, systems that should have failed responded like sleeping muscles, stretching after a long slumber. It wasn't flawless. Alarms blinked, warning lights glowed, but the aircraft was stirring. Aria stood at the foot of the ladder and looked up into the cockpit. Elias leaned out, eyes meeting hers. "She'll fly. But if we take her up, There's no guarantee she'll bring us back. Aria climbed halfway up the ladder so her voice carried to everyone.
Then let's make it clear, here and now.
If you're with me, you accept the risk. We may not land again, but if we don't try, we've already lost. The crew gathered in a loose circle beneath the bomber's belly. No one spoke at first. The sounds of distant sirens drifted through the open hangar doors, reminders of a battle going badly. Finally, Lila stepped forward.
I'm in.
Dawson grunted. I'll keep her breathing. One after another, the others nodded. Elias was last. He stared at Aria for a long moment, then gave a sharp nod. Then let's give them a storm they'll never forget. Aria pulled a folded sheet of paper from her jacket pocket. She had written a single line across it before leaving the command center. If we fail, count this as our last mission. She laid it across a workbench, set a pen beside it. Sign it, she said. Make it ours. There was no ceremony, no speeches. Each member stepped forward, scrawled their name, and stepped back. When it was done, the paper bore the weight of a contract stronger than any order from headquarters. Aria pressed her palm flat against the page. Then it's decided. The engines loomed above them, silent for now, but waiting. For the first time since she'd been silenced in the war room, Aria felt the stir of control returning, not through authority, but through action. They worked without pause. Sweat streaked their faces, uniforms darkened under strain, but the rhythm of movement grew certain, purposeful. The Stratofortress, once a monument to forgotten wars, was being pulled piece by piece back into the present. As dusk edged across the horizon, the bomber's lights flickered on, bathing the hangar in a pale glow. The deep thrum of auxiliary power reverberated through the floor. The beast was stirring, its heart beginning to beat again. Outside, the chaos of the Solara Gulf echoed through the comms. Reports of aircraft destroyed, units in retreat, defenses tightening. The command center continued to spiral, clinging to a doctrine that had already failed. Inside the hangar, however, a different story was unfolding. Aria and her crew stood not before a relic, but before a weapon reborn. Elias slid fully into the cockpit seat, hands gripping the controls. He flicked the ignition, and for a moment there was only silence. Then, with a roar that shook the walls, the first of the 8 engines coughed to life. Flames licked the exhaust before settling into a steady burn. One after another, the engines followed, the air trembling with their collective thunder. Dust cascaded from the rafters, the floor quaked under the vibration. Outside, soldiers and mechanics looked up from their duties, turning toward the hangar in disbelief as the forgotten silhouette began to hum with raw power. Aria climbed into the cockpit and strapped herself into the commander's seat. The panels glowed dimly, warning lights still scattered, but the essential gauges held steady. She placed her hands on the controls, feeling the vibrations surge through her bones. "Status check," she called. "All hydraulics green," Lila confirmed. "Fuel and pressure holding," Dawson reported. Elias glanced at her, a flicker of something like pride in his eyes. "She's ready." Aria looked out through the cockpit glass, the runway stretching away into the fading light. Beyond it lay enemy fire, overwhelming defenses, and a line of generals convinced this aircraft belonged in a museum. She exhaled slowly, the sound lost beneath the rumble of the engines. "Then let's show them what a relic can do." The bomber's wheels shifted, the massive frame inching forward. Each roll of rubber on concrete was a declaration, a defiance of the order that had silenced her hours before. From outside the hangar, crews froze, staring as the colossal shadow moved toward the runway. Some whispered in disbelief, others simply gawked, as if witnessing a ghost. Inside, the crew strapped in, the paper with their signatures tucked safely into Aria's pocket. It wasn't just ink, it was resolve, binding them together. The Stratofortress rolled into the open, 8 engines pounding, the sound carrying across the entire base like thunder, announcing a storm. And as the aircraft lined up with the runway, Aria's gaze hardened. The moment of hesitation had passed. The die was cast. The war room might have shut her voice down, but out here, under the roar of steel and fire, she was about to make herself heard. The runway stretched ahead, a ribbon of concrete shimmering under the fading sun. The bomber rolled slowly into position, its frame trembling with the vibration of 8 awakened engines. Each rotation of the wheels echoed like a challenge, reverberating through the base. Soldiers paused in their work, staring in silence as the massive silhouette loomed larger with every second. What had been a monument of neglect only hours before was now alive, breathing, demanding attention. Inside the cockpit, Aria adjusted her straps, her hands resting firmly on the controls. Elias sat beside her, scanning dials and gauges, his expression locked in focus. Behind them, the crew strapped in at their stations, eyes darting. Across instruments, ears tuned to the rising pitch of the turbines. Every man and woman inside understood what they were about to attempt, and that there would be no return if they faltered.
Final systems check,
Aria said. Her voice was steady, carrying the weight of command without hesitation. Hydraulics confirmed, came Lila's response from the engineering station. Fuel flow consistent, Dawson added, his deep voice even but tight with concentration. All navigation systems responding, another crewman reported, fingers moving quickly over switches. Elias glanced her way. Everything is green. It's now or never. Aria nodded once, eyes narrowing on the expanse of runway ahead. She pushed the throttles forward, and the bomber responded with a shudder that shook the cockpit. The engines screamed higher, their roar rolling across the base like a storm surge. The Stratofortress began to surge forward, slowly at first, then faster, momentum building as the wheels clattered over seams in the concrete. Dust trailed behind, whipped into spirals by the jet wash. The wings stretched wide, their tips slicing the air as though daring the sky to resist. Every second seemed to last longer than the one before. The crew held their breath as the speed climbed, gauges trembling under the strain. Aria's grip never wavered, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Lift in 3, Elias counted. 2, 1. The nose rose, heavy and reluctant, the weight of steel dragging against gravity's pull. For a heartbeat, it seemed the machine would refuse. Then the earth fell away. The wheels left the ground, retracting into their housings with a thud, and the Stratofortress climbed, immense yet unyielding. A wave of disbelief swept across the tarmac. Soldiers shielded their eyes from the glare of the engines as the bomber ascended, some whispering prayers, others simply staring open-mouthed. The sound rattled windows across the base, carrying far beyond the perimeter fence. Inside, relief surged through the crew, but it was tempered by the knowledge of what waited ahead. Aria kept her voice level. We're airborne. Set course for Solara Gulf. Elias adjusted the heading. Locked in. Time to target. Less than an hour. The interior settled into a rhythm of clipped updates and mechanical hums. Each system reported in turn, the aircraft steady though its age showed in the occasional groan of metal under stress. It was no sleek fighter slicing the sky. It was a fortress, deliberate, purposeful, and unstoppable once committed. Aria allowed herself a brief glance at her crew. Dawson hunched over the engineering readouts, sweat already darkening his collar. Lila adjusted valves with precise movements, her lips pressed thin. Elias leaned into the controls, steady hands guiding their course. They were not rookies. They were veterans brought back from the margins, bound together by choice rather than orders. The comms crackled suddenly. Voices from the command center spilled through, urgent, panicked. Reports of more aircraft destroyed, defensive lines faltering, desperation mounting. Medan's voice cut in briefly, sharp with anger, demanding reinforcement that no one could provide. Then static swallowed the signal. Aria turned the dial to silence the chatter. She didn't need to hear more of the chaos they had left behind. What mattered was in front of her. The mission, the target, the chance to change the tide. Clouds brushed against the wings as the bomber pushed higher, leaving the base shrinking in the distance. The ocean spread out beneath them, dark and vast, reflecting streaks of orange from the sinking sun. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay a fortress of anti-aircraft batteries that had already chewed through everything the modern arsenal could offer. Elias broke the silence. They'll scramble fighters the moment they pick us up on radar. They'll try, Aria answered. Her tone carried neither arrogance nor doubt, just certainty. The crew adjusted in their seats, bracing for what they all knew was inevitable. This wasn't a question of if they would be engaged, but when. Minutes passed with only the thrum of engines filling the space. Then the radar operator called out, his voice tight. "Multiple signals inbound. Fast movers. They've spotted us." Elias clenched the controls. "Here we go." Aria didn't look away from the horizon. "Stay on course. Let them come." The blips on the screen drew closer, weaving into formation. Jet fighters, sleek and deadly, closing in on a machine decades older than their youngest pilot. The contrast was almost absurd until the first missile lock alarm shrieked through the cockpit. The crew jolted, hands flying to their stations. Missile lock confirmed. "Starboard side! Countermeasures ready," Lila barked. "Deploy flares," Aria ordered. The bomber spat fire from its belly, trails of decoys burning through the air. A missile streaked past, veering into the flare and detonating in a burst of light. The shockwave rocked the Stratofortress, but it held. Another alarm blared. Dawson shouted over the noise, "They're circling for another run." "Hold steady," Aria said. Her hands gripped the throttles tighter. "We can't waste everything before we reach the line." The fighters roared past the windows, streaks of steel against the sky, then peeled upward in sharp arcs. They were faster, nimbler, deadlier, but they were also predictable. Aria tracked their movements, eyes narrowing. "They think we're easy prey," she muttered. The radar lit up again, another wave of missiles inbound. The crew braced as explosions flared close enough to rattle bones. Metal rang with the impact of shrapnel, panels shook, but the bomber pushed forward, its engines thundering with defiance. Through it all, Aria remained calm, her voice cut through the alarms. "Stay the course! Every second we hold buys us ground when we hit their wall." The crew responded in unison, their voices firm. It wasn't blind obedience. It was trust. The Stratofortress lumbered on, bruised but unbroken, carving a path through the sky toward the Gulf. The fighters circled, regrouping for yet another strike. But as they banked into formation, the bomber's silhouette against the horizon seemed less like a relic and more like a storm front rolling inexorably closer. In the distance, faint glimmers began to spark along the coastline, enemy defenses activating the true gauntlet awakening. The crew tightened their harnesses, each one aware the hardest part had yet to begin. Aria adjusted her grip, her voice low but carrying to every corner of the cabin. Let them throw everything they have. We're not here to dodge, we're here to break them. The Stratofortress roared onward, into the jaws of fire. The coastline loomed ahead, jagged with defense arrays that pulsed on radar like a nest of hornets. Inside the cockpit, the air was taut, every second stretched thin as the crew prepared for what they all knew was coming. They had survived the fighter harassment, but the real gauntlet lay just beyond the horizon. Aria leaned forward, scanning the terrain as the bomber descended slightly. The sunlight spilled across the ocean's surface, casting long streaks of fire on the waves. For the first time since liftoff, she allowed herself a short inhale through her teeth, a reminder of the gravity pressing down on her. Contacts ahead, the radar operator announced. Multiple launch sites. They're locking us now. Elias shifted in the pilot's seat, muscles rigid. They've been waiting for this, Aria spoke with calm precision. Keep us steady. Don't give them the satisfaction of panic. The warning alarms erupted almost instantly. A piercing wail cut through the cabin, joined by the insistent flashing of red indicators across the console. Outside, contrails streaked upward from the shore, sharp white lines against the fading light. Missiles were rising in salvos, dozens of them, snarling toward the sky. The crew braced, every heartbeat syncing with the shrieking sirens. Dawson's voice was a growl. Brace for impact zones. The first detonation came close enough to rattle teeth. A violent shockwave slammed into the fuselage, rocking the bomber on its axis. Panels above their heads quivered, loose bolts whining in protest. But the Stratofortress, ancient as it was, did not break. It held together under the onslaught, groaning like a giant refusing to fall. Aria's hand never left the throttles. Countermeasures, stagger release. Lila triggered the flares, bursts of fire streaking from beneath the wings, dazzling streaks against the dusk. Missiles bent away, slamming into the sea in eruptions of white foam. But more came. Always more. Second wave incoming? The radar operator barked. Shift altitude, Aria ordered. Elias dipped the nose lower, pushing the machine just above the waterline. The bomber howled as it skimmed the waves, the ocean's spray pelting the undercarriage. The sheer mass of the aircraft created a wall of turbulence that churned the surface below into chaos. Missiles chased them relentlessly, but the sudden drop threw the tracking systems into confusion. Several warheads overshot, exploding harmlessly in the air behind. Others plunged into the water, detonating beneath the surface and sending columns of spray skyward. Hold this line, Aria commanded. Ride the waves. The crew clung to their stations, eyes wide, knuckles pale. Every second felt borrowed, each survival a defiance. And yet through it all, Aria's voice carried the weight of steadiness, threading order into chaos. Then came the third volley. Unlike the others, this one was smarter. Guided missiles adjusting with unnerving precision, cutting through the tricks that had bought them seconds before. They're learning, Elias muttered, jaw locked. Then we changed the game, Aria replied. Prepare the decoys. Lila and Dawson worked in tandem, flipping switches, arming pods that hadn't seen combat in years. With a sharp hiss, canisters dropped from the underbelly, scattering metallic fragments into the air. Each fragment spun and emitted signals, dozens of false echoes blooming across enemy radar screens. The effect was immediate. Confused, the incoming missiles broke formation, chasing ghosts instead of the bomber. Some detonated prematurely, brilliant flashes tearing the twilight. Others veered into the false signatures, shredding themselves in futility. The cockpit filled with the roar of explosions around them, but the Stratofortress surged forward through the maelstrom, cloaked in smoke and sea spray. "We're through the first line!" the radar operator shouted, almost disbelieving. Aria's expression didn't change. "Don't celebrate yet. They'll throw everything at us now." As if on cue, new alarms blared. Ahead, on the shoreline, clusters of artillery positions activated, their barrels tilting skyward in eerie unison. Bright flashes rippled along the coast as they unleashed a storm of shells. The sky ahead became a lattice of fire. Heavy rounds screamed past, some bursting in mid-air, showering shrapnel that rattled against the bomber's frame. Others tore into the sea, geysers rising high enough to slap against the wings. "Evasive pattern?" Elias asked, eyes flicking across the chaos. "No," Aria said firmly. "Straight through. We can't bleed off speed now." The order was brutal in its simplicity. No weaving, no hesitation. They would cut directly into the heart of the barrage. The crew obeyed without question. The bomber thundered on, its engines howling defiance. Shards of metal clanged against its body, sparks dancing across the windshield. One round clipped the tail, sending a judder through the entire fuselage. For a moment, the crew held their breath, waiting for disaster, but the old steel endured. Lila wiped grit from her cheek and shouted over the noise. "She's holding!" Aria's reply was low, grim, but resolute. "She'll hold until we finish." The coastline loomed larger, details sharpening with each passing second, the angular structures of bunkers, the skeletal towers of radar dishes, the gleam of missile silos standing like sentinels. The defenses weren't just lines on a map anymore, they were teeth, bared and snapping. The bomber roared into their range and the world erupted. Shells detonated in brilliant arcs, missiles streaked upward like lightning, tracer fire stitched the sky. The Stratofortress ploughed through it all, a leviathan wrapped in flame. Inside, the crew moved like clockwork, their voices clipped but unwavering. Each adjustment keeping the machine balanced against chaos. Aria's eyes never wavered from the horizon. Every explosion reflected in the cockpit glass was ignored, every alarm acknowledged but not indulged. Her focus was singular: break the wall. And then, through the haze, the radar operator's voice cut sharp, primary target range approaching. "This is it!" The crew tightened their grips. Dawson checked the bomb bay systems, fingers flying, sweat pouring down his face. Lila adjusted the controls with precision, muttering figures under her breath. Elias exhaled once, steadying his hands. Aria's tone sharpened. "All stations, ready to deploy." The roar outside rose to a crescendo, a storm trying to tear them from the sky. Yet inside the cockpit, amid alarms and thunder, there was clarity. The mission had distilled to a single moment. Hold steady, release hell. The Stratofortress surged closer, its massive frame shuddering under the fury, hurled against it, but it did not falter. The relic that had been mocked as obsolete had carved its way through fire and steel, bearing down on the enemy's stronghold with unstoppable resolve. And as the coastline glared brighter with incoming fire, Aria's hand hovered over. The final switch, the air thick with the weight of what was about to come. "Bomb bay ready," Dawson called. Aria's eyes narrowed, her voice cutting through the storm. "Then, let's end their wall." The Stratofortress roared forward, a giant with thunder in its belly, about to speak in a voice the enemy would never forget. The bomber tore into the heart of the storm, its massive frame rattling under the strain of incoming fire. Inside the cockpit, the noise was a mix of shrieking alarms, the low rumble of engines pushed to their limits, and the clipped voices of the crew shouting updates. Beyond the glass, the world was ablaze. Streaks of tracer fire cut the dusk, shells erupted into blossoms of smoke, and the shoreline loomed ever closer like a wall of steel bristling with fangs. Targets locked. Dawson barked from his console, his knuckles pale against the controls. Sweat slid down his temple, catching the glow of the dashboard lights. Aria steadied her breathing, eyes locked on the approaching defenses. Every second they delayed was another moment the enemy could adjust. Another chance for a missile to find its mark. "Hold her steady," she ordered, her tone sharp, carrying authority that left no room for hesitation. Elias grunted at the controls, forcing the bomber to cut a line straight into the barrage. The Stratofortress lurched under a near miss, the fuselage shuddering violently, as an explosion ripped close enough to sear paint from its flank. But the aircraft endured, groaning like an ancient beast refusing to die. "Opening bomb bay doors," Dawson announced, voice tight. There was a mechanical whine from deep within the belly of the aircraft. But instead of the satisfying thud of hydraulics working properly, a grinding screech filled the cabin. Warning lights flickered. "Bay doors aren't responding," Dawson shouted. The crew froze for an instant, stunned. The mechanism that carried their payload, the very reason they had braved the gauntlet, was jammed. Aria's voice cut through the momentary silence. "Override it. Manual release." Dawson and Lila exchanged a glance, then leapt from their seats, racing down the narrow corridor into the guts of the aircraft. The air was thick with the tang of oil and burning circuits. Sparks danced along wiring as the bomber jolted from another hit nearby. In the cramped space, they reached the manual release. The heavy lever was rusted from disuse, unmoved for years. Dawson wrapped his massive hands around it, muscles straining as he heaved. The lever resisted, groaning like stone dragged over stone. Lila braced beside him, adding her weight, teeth clenched against the strain. "Come on!" Dawson roared. Another explosion shook the bomber, dust sifting from the ceiling, pipes rattling above their heads. The plane itself seemed to protest as though unwilling to give up its burden. Then, with a violent jolt, the lever gave way. A thunderous metallic crack reverberated through the hull. In the cockpit, Elias saw the indicators flip. "Bomb bay doors open!" Aria didn't wait. "Release first wave. Now!" A deep rumble tore through the aircraft as the payload detached. Through the cockpit glass, the crew glimpsed shadows tumbling into the void, sleek forms slicing downward toward the clustered enemy emplacements. Seconds later, the ground erupted. The shoreline convulsed in rolling waves of fire. Missile batteries vanished in columns of flame. Bunkers splintered into fragments hurled skyward. The sky lit like a second sun rising from below. The horizon drowned in chaos. The crew's seats rattled under the reverberations, the bomber buffeted by shockwaves from its own strike. The air outside was a patchwork of smoke, fire, and collapsing steel. Cheers erupted across the intercom. Even the hardened veterans couldn't contain themselves. "Direct hits, we're tearing them apart!" But Aria didn't smile. Her gaze remained locked ahead, scanning through the haze. "We're not finished. Prepare second wave." Below, the first strike had gutted the outer layer of defenses, but deeper inland, more positions stirred to life. New flashes dotted the shoreline. Reserve launchers firing, scrambling to respond. "They're still in the fight," Elias muttered grimly. Aria's jaw tightened. Then we take everything they have left. The bomber rumbled as Dawson and Lila scrambled back to their stations. The bay doors, now forced open, groaned against the wind but held. The remaining payload waited like thunder caged in steel. Targets realigned, Dawson confirmed. Second wave ready on your mark, Lila added, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Aria took a breath, then gave the order. Release. The Stratofortress shivered as another series of bombs fell, trailing silver shadows against the darkening sky. The earth below convulsed again, detonations ripping through the secondary emplacements. The enemy's second line folded under the assault, radar towers crumpling, launch silos exploding into fountains of debris. The horizon was no longer just dotted with fire, it was consumed by it. A wall of flame rolled inland, smoke clawing into the sky in towering plumes. From the command center far behind, officers watching the live feed fell into stunned silence. Those who had dismissed Aria's plan stared in disbelief as the impossible unfolded. The defenses that had humiliated their modern fighters were disintegrating under the relentless rain of destruction from a machine they had written off as obsolete. Inside the cockpit, the crew braced as turbulence rocked the aircraft from the chain of blasts. Elias fought the controls, keeping the bomber level as shockwaves hammered against its belly. Stabilizers holding, he reported through gritted teeth. Good, Aria said. We're not leaving scraps behind. She glanced down at the instrument panel, then back out toward the inferno below. Prepare the final package. Dawson hesitated. That's everything we've got. Aria's eyes hardened. Exactly. The last payload armed, the bomber lumbered deeper over the coastline, straight into the heart of what remained. Anti-air fire still licked upward, desperate, panicked, but less coordinated now, like the flailing of a wounded animal. Final run, Elias muttered. His hands clenched the controls, sweat running down his temple. Aria's voice was clear, unwavering. Let it fall. The final bomb slipped free. For a heartbeat there was silence, an eerie stillness as the weapons dropped. Then the world convulsed one last time. An entire stretch of coastline erupted in a cataclysm of fire and thunder. Command bunkers collapsed in showers of dust. Reserve missile batteries vanished in molten bursts. A radar tower split in half and toppled like a felled tree. The ground itself seemed to tear apart under the weight of the onslaught. The shockwaves rolled outward, battering the bomber even as it climbed away. Flames clawed skyward, painting the dusk in furious reds and oranges. The ocean below boiled with the force of detonations near the shore, sending waves crashing outward in spirals. For a long moment the crew sat in silence, the enormity of what they had unleashed sinking in. Then the radar operator's voice cracked through the stillness. No more locks, no more launches. Their grid is gone. Inside the command center, miles away, the silence was deafening. Generals who had laughed hours earlier stared wide-eyed at the feeds, their disbelief etched across every face. Not one dared speak. In the cockpit, Aria finally allowed herself a slow exhale. The fire reflected in her eyes, but her tone remained cold steel. That's how you break a wall. The bomber leveled out, smoke trailing against the backdrop of a shattered horizon. Below, the once impenetrable defenses lay in ruins, consumed by the fury of a machine they had dismissed. And above it all, the Stratofortress continued its steady climb, engines thundering, a ghost of another era proving itself undeniable. The firestorm receded behind them, a scar of smoke stretching across the coastline. Inside the cockpit, The instruments still trembled from the concussions, and the fuselage groaned as if the steel itself remembered every impact it had survived. The crew sat in their stations, drenched in sweat, hearts still pounding, but not a single pair of eyes drifted from their duties. They had broken through, but none of them dared assume it was finished. Aria scanned the horizon ahead. What had once been a seamless defensive wall was now fractured, burning in patches, yet she knew the enemy would not concede easily. Behind the shattered perimeter, deeper threats would be stirring, sights hidden inland, waiting for moments like this. The radio crackled, static filling the cabin before a voice broke through. "Unidentified heavy craft, you are violating restricted airspace. Turn back immediately or you will be engaged." The accent was harsh, clipped, the challenge unmistakable. Elias smirked grimly.
They finally decided to talk.
Aria leaned closer to the comms. Her reply was calm, deliberate. "Tell them silence isn't the same as surrender. We're not turning back." She cut the line before a response could come. The radar pinged again. A new cluster of signatures bloomed across the screen, this time approaching from inland rather than the sea. Fighters, fresh squadrons scrambled to intercept. "Here they come," the operator announced. Aria's hands tightened on the controls. "We've rattled their cage. Now they'll throw everything they've got left." The first interceptors slashed through the haze, sunlight glinting off their sleek frames. They came in fast, banking low before rising to flank the bomber. Missiles armed, cannons hot. "Multiple bogies closing," Elias reported, his voice taut.
"Stay steady," Aria said. "Let them make the first mistake."
The fighters dived. Cannon fire streaked past the cockpit, tearing lines through the sky. Tracers peppered the bomber's wings, sparks flashing as rounds ricocheted off armor plating. The Stratofortress juddered, but the thick frame absorbed more punishment than its enemies expected.
"They're testing us,"
Dawson muttered, gripping the side of his console.
"They'll regret it,"
Aria replied. "Lila, prepare countermeasure cycle." The engineer's hands flew across her panel. "Ready on your mark." Another pass screamed by, closer this time, rounds puncturing the fuselage with sharp metallic cracks. One alarm wailed as hydraulic pressure dipped, but Dawson was already on it, rerouting flow to stabilize. "They can't stop us with harassment runs," Elias growled. "They'll have to commit." As if answering him, two fighters peeled wide, circling back for missile runs. The shrill tone of lock-on filled the cockpit. "Deploy now," Aria ordered. Lila punched the release, and streams of flares burst outward, dazzling streaks of heat that bent the missiles away. Two detonated harmlessly in the distance, fireballs fading into nothing. The others streaked past, overshooting in confusion. "Good work," Aria said sharply, "but they won't give up." The next wave came harder. 4 interceptors surged from below, unleashing a storm of fire at the belly of the bomber. Shrapnel rattled like hail against the frame. Panels shook loose, dangling wires sparking in the engineering bay. Dawson slammed a hand against the comms. "We've got breaches in the lower compartments. Seal them," Aria commanded. Her crew obeyed without hesitation, voices firm even as alarms screamed. The Stratofortress might have been built in another era, but inside it pulsed. With life, every member of the team part of the machine's heartbeat. Through the canopy, Aria caught sight of the coastline shrinking beneath them, flames marking their path. Ahead, hills rolled inland, ridgelines casting shadows across the landscape. She knew the fight would shift there. Missile trucks, mobile artillery, hidden emplacements waiting in the valleys. "They'll drag us deeper," she murmured. "Try to trap us in their net." Elias shot her a sidelong glance. And? Her reply was simple. We don't stop moving. The fighters regrouped for another assault. This time, however, Aria shifted tactics. Instead of keeping a straight course, she pulled the bomber into a shallow bank, skimming just above the ridgelines. The massive wings skimmed the contours of the land, forcing the faster jets to overshoot. One interceptor misjudged, diving too low as it tried to adjust. The pilot yanked upward, but too late. The jet slammed into the slope and exploded in a blossom of fire, fragments scattering across the hillside. The crew erupted with a cheer, but Aria's voice cut them short. Eyes forward. That was their mistake, not our victory. More signatures lit the radar, dozens of blips converging. They weren't chasing a kill, they were tightening a cage. We're being funneled, the operator warned. Aria's mind raced. The Stratofortress couldn't outmaneuver fighters indefinitely, and ammunition wasn't limitless. But brute force was what they had, and brute force was what they would use. She leaned toward Elias. Line us up with that ridge ahead. We're going to climb just enough to clear it, then drop hard. Elias frowned but nodded, adjusting the controls. Copy that. The bomber surged upward, engines howling. The fighters followed, streaking to intercept, weapons armed. At the crest of the ridge, Aria gave the order. Now, drop! Elias yanked the controls, and the Stratofortress dove, its enormous bulk plunging like a falling mountain. The sudden maneuver disoriented the pursuing jets. Two overshot completely, unable to correct in time. One fired a missile too late, the warhead detonating in open air, far behind its intended mark. The dive ended with the bomber leveling out low over the valley floor, engines straining but steady. The fighters scrambled to re-engage, but the moment had given them breathing room. Aria's knuckles whitened on the throttles. That's the last trick we get. From here, it's endurance. The words were grim, but her eyes burned with resolve. Every gamble, every maneuver had brought them closer. And now, with the valley opening ahead and enemy strongholds still to come, there was no turning back. Outside, the sky remained a storm of smoke and fire. But within the Stratofortress, the crew was locked together by something. Stronger than steel, a collective will to finish what they had started. The bomber thundered inland, each mile earned through fire and grit, carrying with it not just payloads of destruction, but the weight of defiance against every voice that had once tried to silence them. The valley stretched out like a scar carved into the earth, steep cliffs hemming the bomber on both sides. The Stratofortress cut through the low airspace, engines straining, wings slicing the currents close to the rock. Behind them, interceptors wheeled back into position, trying to press the advantage. Ahead, the radar began to scream again, new signatures, stationary this time, hidden emplacements buried in the ridgeline. They've set up ground batteries in the cliffs, the operator shouted. We're in their kill box. Aria's jaw tensed. It was a trap she had expected, but seeing the scope of it on the screen still struck like a hammer. Dozens of launchers angled upward, camouflaged until now igniting with sudden flares as missiles arced skyward from both sides of the gorge. Multiple launches, Elias warned. Aria didn't hesitate. Brace. Hold course. The sky fractured into streaks of fire. Warheads spiraled toward them in coordinated volleys, converging on the bomber's massive frame. The first detonation slammed against the airframe with concussive force, rattling every bolt, shuddering the cabin. Sparks burst from an overhead panel, smoke curling through the vents. Port stabilizer damaged, Dawson reported, his voice raw with strain. Compensate manually, Aria replied, eyes locked forward. Elias wrestled the yoke, muscles straining as the bomber resisted, its weight dragging against every correction. Yet somehow the Leviathan kept its line, pushing deeper into the gauntlet. Lila's hands blurred across her console. Countermeasures spent. We can't rely on flares anymore. Then we use everything else, Aria said, her tone cutting through the noise. Deploy chaff, cycle jammers, make them choke on static. Metallic shards spewed into the air, glinting briefly before dispersing into a cloud of false signals. At the same time, electronic pulses rippled outward, jamming frequencies. Radar screens on the ground flickered, confused. A handful of missiles veered off target, detonating prematurely in bursts of wasted fire. But not all. One slammed close beneath the fuselage, rocking the bomber hard enough to throw Lila against her harness. She grimaced, gripping her straps until her knuckles whitened. Minor breach in the lower compartment, Dawson confirmed grimly. We'll hold for now. The cockpit reeked of ozone and scorched insulation, the air thick with the metallic tang of burned wiring. Every breath was a reminder of how close they were to collapse. Through it all, Aria remained rigid, her voice steady. We've come too far to turn now. Push her through. The bomber pressed on, an iron silhouette carving through a corridor of fire. Explosions lit the cliffs on both sides, echoing like rolling thunder trapped in the canyon. Fighter jets above circled back, unleashing strafing runs that stitched the sky with glowing lines. The Stratofortress groaned under the combined assault, but still it flew, unwilling to break. Targets in range, Dawson called. His tone carried urgency, but also something else. Hope. Aria's eyes narrowed. Prepare release sequence. The bay doors, still groaning from their earlier manual override, shuddered open. The mechanism whined in protest, but it obeyed. Beneath them, the cliffs crawled with enemy emplacements, missile launchers glowing as they cycled for another strike. Now, Aria commanded. The payload dropped. The valley below was consumed in eruptions. Fire ripped across the ridges, tearing launchers apart in bursts that flung debris into the air. Rock faces split under the concussions, avalanches cascading down in massive sheets, towers folded inward, collapsing into themselves. The Stratofortress shook from the chain of detonations, buffeted by turbulence. That made Elias wrestle the controls, as though holding back a beast. Dust and smoke swallowed the gorge, blotting out everything below. Direct hits across the line, the operator confirmed, disbelief in his voice. They're gone, every one of them. For a moment, silence fell inside the cockpit, broken only by the low growl of the engines. Then Dawson exhaled sharply, a sound between a laugh and a gasp, but Aria didn't relax. Stay alert, they'll have another card. Her prediction proved right almost immediately. The radar screamed again, new contacts surging from beyond the mountains. More interceptors, this time heavier, larger, their silhouettes unmistakable, strike fighters loaded for kill missions. They're sending everything left in the arsenal, Elias muttered. They think we're crippled, Aria answered. Let's prove them wrong. The new jets closed fast, unleashing salvos of guided rockets. Trails of fire streaked the air, converging like spears. The Stratofortress banked hard, slow compared to its hunters, but precise under Aria's command. Rockets whistled past, detonating in furious blooms around them. One struck the outer wing, tearing metal into jagged strips. The bomber lurched sideways, the wingtip trailing smoke. "We've lost lift on the right!" Dawson cried. "Balance it!" Aria snapped. Elias gritted his teeth, hauling the controls. The bomber staggered, fighting against its own wounded body, but held its altitude by sheer will and steel. Aria's voice cut sharp.
Prepare final strike. We end this before they tear us apart.
The crew moved with urgency, adrenaline sharpening their focus. The last of their payload waited, armed and primed. The target was no longer just the valley. They aimed for the command hub beyond, the brain coordinating the onslaught. The radar locked. Coordinates glowed across the screen.
"Bomb bay ready,"
Dawson confirmed, voice hoarse. Aria's hand hovered over the release.
"This is it."
She pressed the switch. The Stratofortress convulsed as the final load tore free. The earth below seemed to pause, holding its breath. Then the ground erupted in a chain of violent blasts. The hidden command bunkers disintegrated under the assault, concrete shredding into clouds of dust and flame. Power grids sparked, collapsing into darkness. A control tower toppled sideways, disappearing into a wall of fire. The valley, once a trap designed to annihilate intruders, became a graveyard of shattered emplacements. The shockwaves clawed at the bomber, rattling the crew in their harnesses, but the aircraft clawed upward, rising through the haze of its own destruction. From the rear, Lila's voice cracked through, strained but fierce. "They're falling back. Fighters are breaking formation." On the radar, the hostile signatures wavered, scattering as disarray spread. Without their central command, coordination collapsed. The fighters, once precise and relentless, now flew chaotically, some diving away entirely. Inside the cockpit, Elias glanced at Aria, disbelief flickering in his eyes. "You did it. We actually—" She cut him off with a look. "We did it, all of us." The Stratofortress soared above the burning gorge, smoke trailing from its battered frame. It had weathered the storm, shattered the trap, and silenced the enemy's core. And though every alarm still blared, though damage reports still rolled in, there was no mistaking the truth. They had carved a path where none was meant to exist. The bomber leveled out, engines growling like a wounded predator that refused to stop. Behind them, the valley smoldered. Ahead, the sky opened wide. For the first time since their ascent, Aria allowed herself a breath that was not laced with tension, but with certainty. The mission was not finished, but the tide had turned, and the relic that had been mocked was rewriting the field of battle. The bomber clawed upward through the haze, its wings trembling as though every bolt and rivet bore the weight of survival. Behind it, the valley writhed with fire, the once coiled trap now reduced to fractured ridges and smoldering wreckage. The Stratofortress emerged from the plume like a leviathan rising from ash, scarred yet undeniable. Inside the cockpit, the air was heavy with the sting of smoke and ozone. Panels flickered with stubborn life, warning lights pulsing red across the console. The crew strapped in tight, battered by turbulence, but their eyes glimmered with something fierce, an unspoken realization that they had outlasted what was meant to destroy them. Aria's voice carried calm command. "Assess systems. Right wing is compromised but stable," Dawson reported, scanning his instruments with narrowed focus. "Hydraulics rerouted. She's flying, though she hates us for it." "Fuel consumption climbing," Lila added. "Engines are bleeding efficiency, but will make distance." The radar operator leaned forward. "Enemy fighters scattering. They've lost cohesion." His tone was incredulous, as though even he couldn't quite believe the sight of hostile signatures peeling away in disarray. Elias adjusted the controls, sweat streaking his brow. They didn't expect this. Nobody did. Aria's gaze pierced the horizon. "That's exactly why we're not finished. They'll regroup if we give them time." The bomber pressed forward, leaving the broken valley behind. Below, the land unfurled in uneven shadows, forests shredded by shockwaves, roads fractured, and the remains of once covert emplacements now glowing embers. Every mile gained was carved from resistance that had been deemed impenetrable. In the command center, far from the front, silence reigned. Officers who had laughed at Aria earlier sat frozen, their screens filled with live feeds of devastation wrought by the very craft they had written off. The generals' faces had hardened, drained of their earlier smugness. Madden, once thunderous in his disdain, now leaned forward with pale knuckles gripping the table. Not a word left his lips as he watched the impossible unfold. Back in the cockpit, a sudden tremor rippled through the frame. Alarms blared. "Engine 3 is fluctuating," Dawson barked. "She's overheating." Aria's reply was firm. "Feather it! Keep the rest balanced." The throttle shifted, the ancient beast adjusting to fight on with less than it had moments ago. The sound changed, deeper and more guttural, but still steady. Through the canopy, the terrain shifted again. A plateau stretched forward, its surface jagged with defensive scars. Beyond it, faint in the distance, lay the outlines of an airfield, the hub that had coordinated every assault so far. The heart of the enemy's operations. Elias spotted it first. There it is, their nest. The radar operator confirmed. Heavy activity, transport craft on the ground, fuel depots, command towers, and anti-air still online. Aria studied the map, her jaw tightening. The final bastion was awake, and it was ready. "They'll expect us crippled," she said. "They'll expect us retreating." She leaned forward, eyes sharp as blades. "They won't expect us to finish it." The crew shifted, each member drawing tighter into their harnesses, bracing not only for what lay ahead, but for the certainty that this would be the hardest run yet. The first barrage came before they reached visual range. Missiles erupted from launchers hidden in the plateau, streaking into the sky like furious arrows. Aria snapped orders without hesitation. "Jammers active! Feed them noise!" Electronic pulses rippled outward. Some of the incoming warheads twisted off course, confused by the cloud of false signals. Others pushed through, detonating dangerously close, showering the fuselage with shrapnel. The bomber lurched, groaning in protest. "We can't take too many more of those," Elias warned. Aria's reply was cold iron. "Then we won't." They pushed lower, hugging the contour of the land. The Stratofortress roared across the plateau, so close the crew could see dust trails rising in their wake. Enemy gunners scrambled, struggling to track the massive silhouette. As it thundered past at an altitude no one thought it would dare. Tracer fire peppered the air, some rounds slamming into the underbelly with sharp clangs. Panels sparked, warning lights glowed, but the bomber kept driving forward, relentless in its purpose. Dawson shouted over the cacophony. "We're holding by stubbornness alone. That's all we need," Aria answered. The target drew closer. The airfield loomed, sprawling across the plain, its runways lined with craft waiting for deployment, its control tower gleaming like a spear above the complex. The hub that had orchestrated every strike against them stood defiant but vulnerable. "Bomb bay status?" Aria demanded. "Doors still open from last drop," Dawson replied. "Systems strained, but we can deliver." Aria nodded once. "This is the strike that matters. Everything else was the path. This is the blow that ends it." Elias's grip on the controls tightened. "Then let's carve it into history." They lined up on approach. Alarms screamed again. More interceptors scrambled from the airfield, climbing rapidly to intercept. Missiles armed on their wings claws reaching for the intruder. Fighters inbound, closing fast. The operator called. Aria's eyes didn't leave the target. Ignore them. Focus forward. The Stratofortress barreled toward the airfield. Anti-air emplacements lit the sky, shells bursting in violent blossoms around them. The crew's voices overlapped. Damage reports, confirmations, systems straining to the edge. Still, the bomber pressed on, every second etched with defiance. "Release on my mark," Aria commanded. The crosshairs aligned, the airfield filling the canopy. Elias held the line, fighting the turbulence as the ground defenses clawed upward. "Now!" Aria barked. The final salvo tumbled free. Time seemed to stall. The bombs descended, silent shadows falling into the teeth of the enemy stronghold. Then impact, one after another, each detonation carving through the complex. Runways split apart, fuel depots erupted into towering pillars of flame, aircraft waiting on the ground vanished in fireballs. The control tower collapsed in on itself, shattering into rubble and smoke. The horizon lit with devastation so fierce it turned night into day. Shockwaves battered the Stratofortress, tossing it upward, buffeting it like a toy. Inside, the crew gritted against the violence, harnesses digging into their shoulders. When the shaking eased, only ruins remained below. The enemy's command hub was no longer a beacon of coordination, it was a crater of fire, its signals silenced forever. For a moment, there was only quiet inside the cockpit, the enormity of what they had accomplished settling in. Then the radar operator's voice broke the stillness. All contacts retreating, fighters disengaging, the skies clear. Elias exhaled, his shoulders sagging. "They're finished." Aria didn't answer immediately. She stared out at the inferno below, the fire reflecting in her eyes. When she spoke, her voice was low, resolute. "No, they're finished because we didn't stop." The Stratofortress climbed through the drifting smoke, battered but unbroken. Behind it, the heart of the enemy lay in ruins. Ahead, the open sky stretched wide, a path carved by defiance and fire. In that moment, there was no mistaking what had happened. An aircraft dismissed as a relic had turned the tide of a war. And the generals who had silenced Aria Kessler now had nothing left to say. The air was thick with smoke and the faint shimmer of heat rising from the ruins below. The Stratofortress climbed gradually, every creak and groan of the fuselage reminding the crew of the punishment it had endured. Yet in the cockpit, the silence was more powerful than the alarms that still blinked on their panels. They had silenced an entire war machine. The enemy hub was gone, its network of defenses gutted. Aria sat upright, her hands firm on the throttles. Her eyes remained fixed on the open sky ahead, though the devastation below reflected faintly across the glass canopy. She hadn't spoken since the last bombs had fallen, and the crew respected that quiet. They all understood the gravity of what they had accomplished. It was Elias who broke the hush. We should be out of their reach now, no more interceptors on the board. The radar operator confirmed, scanning the screens again. He's right. The sky is clear. Not a single hostile contact left. His voice faltered with disbelief before steadying. They're gone. Dawson leaned back in his chair, his massive frame sinking against the restraints. I'll believe it when this thing's wheels touch solid ground again. A few low chuckles followed, brief but genuine. The tension hadn't vanished. It simply loosened its grip for the first time since they'd taken flight. Aria allowed the moment to linger, then spoke. Stay sharp. A clear sky doesn't mean a safe one. We still have to bring her home. The words were enough to tighten every set of shoulders again. They knew she was right. The Stratofortress had survived firestorms and ambushes, but it was wounded, its body scarred and weakened. Getting it back to base was no simple matter. They angled toward friendly airspace, the bomber groaning as Elias adjusted the course. The engines, once thunderous, now carried a deeper rasp, like an old warrior breathing through clenched teeth. Inside, systems sputtered, some failing entirely, others flickering like dying embers, but refusing to give out completely. From her station, Lila reported in. "Fuel is thin. We'll make it, but only if we keep everything trimmed tight. No excess burn." Elias gave a short nod, easing the controls. "We'll nurse her the rest of the way." The minutes stretched long. Through the windows, the horizon shifted from the scorched battlefield toward calmer skies. The ocean shimmered faintly beneath them, a vast expanse catching the last glow of fading sunlight. For the first time since liftoff, it seemed they might actually survive, but survival was never simple. Without warning, a metallic groan echoed from deep within the structure. The bomber shuddered, jolting the crew against their harnesses. Dawson scanned his readouts, eyes narrowing. "Pressure drop in engine 4. She's losing thrust." Aria didn't flinch. "Feather it. Distribute load to the others." Dawson hesitated. "That'll put more strain on the rest." "Then the rest will bear it," Aria replied, her voice like steel. With a grunt, Dawson complied. The trembling eased, though the engines roared louder, fighting to compensate. Every man and woman on board felt the change, the heavy drag pulling at their bones. Yet the Stratofortress pressed on, stubborn, unwilling to surrender to its wounds. Miles away, in the command center, silence still reigned. The live feed of the bomber returning was plastered across every screen, its battered frame visible against the twilight sky. The officers who had mocked Aria earlier sat rigid, their faces pale with a mixture of shame and awe. General Madan stood motionless, his jaw locked, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles whitened. None dared to speak. The relic they had dismissed had not only survived, but had accomplished what their prized modern arsenal could not. Back in the cockpit, the crew pressed forward. Sweat stung their eyes, fatigue gnawed at their limbs, but they kept moving. Aria's presence anchored them, her calm, unyielding tone cutting through exhaustion as she issued updates and commands. She wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. Every word was enough. At last, the coastline of home emerged in the distance. The sight sparked murmurs across the intercom, a cautious swell of relief. But the bomber wasn't ready to give them an easy landing. As they began their descent, a harsh grinding echoed from the landing gear compartments. Dawson's console flashed red. "Starboard gears jammed. It's not deploying." The breath caught in the cabin. Without both sets of wheels, the landing would be catastrophic. "Options?" Elias demanded. "Manual override," Dawson answered, his voice rough. "But it means climbing down there mid-flight." Aria didn't hesitate. "Do it." The engineer unbuckled, bracing himself as he pushed toward the rear. The interior shook with turbulence, each step a battle. He reached the compartment, tools clattering against his belt, and threw open the panel. The gears were twisted, warped from earlier hits. Smoke curled from the mechanism. "Talk to me," Aria called over comms. Dawson gritted his teeth, forcing a wrench into the jammed assembly. The steel resisted, grinding like bone against bone. The bomber lurched, nearly throwing him off balance. He roared with effort, sweat pouring down his face. With a sudden crack, the mechanism gave way. The landing gear jolted downward, slamming into place with a heavy thud. "Gear deployed!" Dawson shouted, chest heaving. Cheers erupted, echoing through the cabin. Elias exhaled sharply, his hands tightening on the controls. "Now we've got a chance." Aria's voice cut through, measured but firm. "Line her up. Bring us home." The base tower crackled to life over comms. "Stratofortress, we have visual. You are cleared for immediate landing. Welcome back." The controller's voice carried awe, edged with disbelief. The runway lights stretched ahead, twin rivers of white piercing the dusk. The Stratofortress descended, its engines straining, smoke trailing from battered panels. The descent was rough, uneven, the bomber fighting every inch of the way. Elias guided it with steady hands, knuckles tight, eyes fixed forward. The wheels struck concrete with a thunderous slam. Tires screeched, the airframe shuddered, sparks bursting from the undercarriage. For a moment, it seemed the beast might collapse under its own weight. But it held, rolling forward, slowing gradually until it came to a grinding, breathless stop. The engines wound down into silence. Inside, the crew sagged against their harnesses, every ounce of energy drained. The only sound was their breathing, deep, heavy, alive. Outside, figures were already rushing toward them. Mechanics, medics, and soldiers gathered along the runway, their faces illuminated by floodlights. Some shouted orders, others simply stared, jaws slack. The hatch opened with a metallic groan. Aria stepped out first, her uniform streaked with soot and sweat, her hair damp against her forehead. She descended the ladder slowly, boots striking the ground with deliberate weight. The crowd erupted. Applause, shouts, and whistles filled the air, echoing across the tarmac. Dozens of hands clapped together, voices rising in unison. The noise swelled like a tide, a roar of recognition for what had just been achieved. Her crew followed one by one, each emerging battered but unbroken, greeted by the same outpouring of respect. Men and women who had once dismissed them now cheered, eyes wide with admiration. And then the crowd parted. The generals stood at the edge, rigid in their uniforms, their expressions carved from stone. General Medan's eyes burned with something unspoken, anger, shame, perhaps even awe. But he said nothing. His silence spoke louder than any words could. Aria's gaze met his for a long moment. Then she turned away, her voice carrying to the men and women who had risked everything at her side. Strength doesn't belong to an era. It belongs to those willing to wield it. Her words cut through the air, sharp and unforgettable. In the days to come, they would be repeated across the base, etched into memory. They would be painted on the walls of the hangar, carved into steel plates, and carried like a creed by those who had witnessed this day. The Stratofortress, a relic mocked as obsolete, had not only survived, it had triumphed. Its shadow lay across the runway, long and defiant in the fading light. And Aria Kessler, once silenced and dismissed, now stood as the commander who had broken an unbreakable wall, whose legacy was sealed not by words spoken in a war room, but by thunder rolled across the horizon. The engines had gone silent, but their echo lingered across the tarmac, carried in the pounding hearts of everyone who had watched the impossible unfold. The Stratofortress sat there like a monument, scarred and smoke-streaked. Yet standing tall after a storm no one believed it could weather. Around it, the airbase pulsed with awe, mechanics whispering, medics standing, still in disbelief, soldiers clapping until their palms burned. For hours the sky had belonged to the enemy. Now it belonged to the shadow of a machine everyone had laughed at. Guided by the steady hand of a commander they had tried to silence. In one flight, the line between past and present was erased, and the battlefield learned a lesson carved. In steel, power is not in the age of the weapon, but in the will of those who dare to use it. Inside the command center, The same generals who had mocked her sat frozen, unable to hide their shame. They had seen precision jets fall, drones crumble, and defenses they trusted collapse. Yet the voice they dismissed, the one they ordered silenced, had rewritten the outcome. No argument, no defense remained, only silence. Aria Kessler walked from the bomber with her crew at her side, every step heavy with exhaustion, every gaze fixed forward. They were not paraded as relics anymore. They were champions, proof that courage and conviction mattered more than polished doctrine. Her words, spoken at the runway's edge, carried like a creed across the base. Strength belongs not to heroes, but to those who dare. And so the story of a forgotten giant was reborn. Not as a relic, not as nostalgia, but as thunder rolled across the horizon, announcing that even the strongest walls can be broken when someone refuses to bow. This is Silent Defenders. What would you have done? Mock the relic or trust the storm it carried?